On the morning of the gallery opening, my son turned to me and hissed under his breath, "Don't touch anything, don't speak, just stay in the corner." It was said like a command to a servant, not a son speaking to his father. The words didn't just sting, they settled in my chest like a weight I could not shift. I had raised him, carried him on my shoulders when he was small, built a home, brick by brick, so he could grow without fear. And yet here I was, reduced to a shadow, told to fold myself into silence. I wanted to laugh, but the sound never came. The anger sat hot in my throat, while shame pressed its cold hand against the back of my neck. He didn't see me as family anymore, only as a liability, a piece of clutter that might embarrass him in front of his world. I caught my reflection in the polished glass of the gallery door before we entered. I didn't look like the man he imagined me to be. An old relic out of place, unpolished, unneeded. Inside, the walls glowed white, alive with paintings and golden frames. People drifted in, elegant with practiced smiles and hushed laughter. He walked ahead of me, back straight, eyes sharp, making sure no one would mistake him for anything less than important. I trailed behind like a ghost. I could almost hear his warning still ringing, "Stay in the corner." But it wasn't the corner that stung me. It was the fact that he wanted me hidden. My own son, the boy who once reached for my hand in crowded streets, now recoiled from my presence. He believed I was something to conceal, something that might soil the shine of his borrowed prestige. And I stood there, quiet, swallowing the storm that raged inside me. I thought of all the years when my hands had been my only currency. Hands that bled from work, hands that carved beauty when no one was watching. He had never asked about those days, never cared to know what it meant to sign your name not on contracts or business deals, but on something that carried your soul. To him, that world had no worth. As I pressed myself back against the cold wall, watching him introduce himself to the art dealer with pride, I understood the cruelty wasn't in the words alone. It was in the dismissal, the certainty that my presence was nothing more than an inconvenience. He had spoken it with the ease of someone who had already decided. His father belonged in the shadows, invisible. And yet, as much as he wanted me to disappear, he did not know what still lived in the light, what had been signed, painted, and left behind in this very room. Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. Write in the comments, please. Where are you listening from? Has something like this ever happened in your life? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. Your support helps us grow this channel and bring you more stories every day. And now, let's continue. The gallery smelled of varnish and quiet money. Every surface gleamed with polish. Every step echoed with the weight of shoes that had never known dust or labor. The walls stretched high, dressed in gold frames and oil-painted stories. This was not a place for men like me, not a place for calloused hands or shoes that had walked through rain. I could feel it in the way people's eyes slid past me, the way their conversations curled in soft laughter that never invited me in. I stood a little apart, careful not to move too quickly, careful not to let my breathing disturb the rhythm of the room. My son walked ahead of me like he belonged to them, chin high, every gesture rehearsed. He moved from one collector to the next, his voice weaving into their conversations with ease, as though he had been born into this circle rather than raised in a house that smelled of sweat and old paint. I watched him smile the kind of smile he had never given me, polished, practiced, stripped of sincerity. And with each handshake he offered, I felt myself shrink further into the shadows, an intruder in a world I had unknowingly given him the key to. The paintings on the wall glowed beneath soft lighting, each one carrying stories of artists who had poured themselves into the canvas. I looked at the brushstrokes, the familiar tremble of lines, the weight of color layered with patience. I knew that language. Paint was not just paint. It was memory. It was longing. It was nights without sleep. My son admired them like trophies, like expensive ornaments, without seeing the pulse that still lived beneath the dried oils. I stood behind him, and in my silence, I could almost hear the voices of the men and women who had left their souls on those frames. It felt like standing among ghosts who were respected only after they were gone. I stayed still, my back close to the wall, watching the crowd glide across the polished floor. The men wore suits that whispered of wealth. The women carried elegance in their hands as if it were a glass of wine. Their laughter was measured, their admiration delicate, as though too much emotion would break the spell of the evening. And me? I was no more to them than the man who had wandered in by accident, tolerated out of politeness, invisible unless I dared to move too close. What pained me most was not their silence, but his. My son never once turned to acknowledge me, never introduced me, never let his eyes meet mine. To him, I was a shadow he had to drag along, a reminder of something too ordinary, too unrefined. I could almost hear his earlier words repeating with every glance he cast away from me, "Stay in the corner." It was not just instruction, it was the truth of how he saw me, a man to be hidden, forgotten. And yet, as I stood there, staring at the glowing frames, a strange ache rose in my chest. Because among those paintings, in the lines and colors, I felt something I had once known, something I had touched, something that still carried my breath, though no one else could see it yet. I said nothing, I only waited. For sometimes justice doesn't come with loud footsteps. It waits in silence, steady, certain, until the moment when truth can no longer be ignored. Every introduction skipped over me like a stone skimming water, never sinking, never landing. My son moved with certainty, guiding the art dealer and his friends through the hall as though he were the rightful owner of the air they breathed. His voice carried, his laughter folded neatly into theirs, but not once did it reach me. I stood in their circle without belonging to it, a shadow leaning against the edges of their light. When their eyes brushed past me, they carried the same expression, polite, detached, as if I were a piece of furniture pushed against the wall. I was no one's guest, no one's host. I was simply the old man he brought along. It is a particular kind of humiliation to be present, but unseen. I felt it in the way their conversations curled away from me, as if my silence confirmed that I had nothing to give. I remembered the years when every word from my mouth shaped the path of my household, when my son listened because he believed my voice carried wisdom. Now he spoke louder than me, faster, eager to cover me with his words, as if mine no longer mattered. I watched his hands gesturing, firm and certain, hands that had never bled for survival, never trembled from exhaustion. He presented himself as a man of refinement, yet I knew the roots of that polish were watered with my sweat. I thought of the nights when he was young, when we sat at the table together, his small hands resting on my arm as I sketched lines in the dim light. He would ask what I was doing, and I would tell him that every stroke mattered, even the ones no one noticed. He didn't remember those nights, or perhaps he had chosen to forget them, as he had chosen to forget me in this room. To him, the man standing silently at the edge of his circle was no longer his father, but an inconvenience. The crowd grew denser as more collectors arrived, the air filling with the sound of glasses clinking and velvet laughter. I stayed still, steadying myself against the slow tide of shame pressing closer. My son never introduced me, not once. He looked at me occasionally, quick glances sharp with warning, as if daring me to step forward, to remind these people of who I was. His fear was not that I would embarrass myself, it was that I would embarrass him. Invisible, that was the word. To be invisible in your own child's eyes is a pain that settles deeper than insult. It is not simply being overlooked, it is being erased. And yet, as I stood among those strangers, I felt something stir, something quiet but unyielding. Because invisibility is not the same as absence. The truth was still there, written in places he had forgotten, waiting for its hour. And when that hour came, I would not need to raise my voice. My silence would be enough. My presence, the one he tried so hard to shrink, would speak louder than his entire performance. I had built my life with my hands, hands that bore the proof of labor, scars that told stories no one asked to hear. My palms were maps of sacrifice, each line a reminder of the hours I traded for bread on the table, for shoes on his feet, for the roof that kept him safe when storms rattled the windows. I never signed contracts worth fortunes, never shook hands with collectors in suits. My mark was left in beams that held a house upright, in the steady rhythm of tools striking against resistance, in the quiet satisfaction of work that asked for nothing but endurance. My legacy was not written in galleries. It lived in walls that stood because I had built them. And yet, here he was, my own son, dismissing me as though those years had never happened. His success was stacked on the invisible foundation of my sweat, but he could not bear to admit it. Watching him glide across that polished floor head high, pretending I was nothing more than an accident standing in his way, felt like watching a wall crumble. Not a wall of stone, but the wall of respect I thought we had built together over the years. The slow erosion of it had begun long ago. Small cracks in conversations, subtle refusals to listen, a sharp edge of embarrassment whenever I spoke too loudly or laughed too freely in front of his friends. Tonight, though, the collapse was complete. He had reduced me to a shadow, a man stripped of dignity in the very house of dignity, a gallery of art. What he never understood was that dignity is not given, it is carved. It is earned in silence, in sacrifice, in doing what no one applauds. My son looked at me and saw calluses where others displayed signatures. But I knew that sometimes calluses are the truest form of a signature, one written in flesh, etched into the skin by the weight of love and duty. He could not see it, because he had trained his eyes to recognize only what was polished, framed, and applauded. The ache inside me was quiet but relentless. It was not the sharp pain of insult, but the slow, heavy sorrow of betrayal. I remembered his childhood, his small arms reaching for me, his trust so complete it was almost frightening. I remembered how he once looked at me as though I could move mountains. Now he avoided my gaze as though even standing near me was dangerous, a risk to the image he was trying to sell. That memory cut deeper than any insult. Because what does it mean for a father to be present but unwanted, to be alive, yet treated as if he were already gone? I stood in that gallery surrounded by gold frames and forgotten names, and I realized this was not about me being unworthy of his world. This was about him being unworthy of mine. He thought I belonged in the corner, invisible, silent. But one day, soon, he would learn that what he tried to bury could not be erased. My hands had touched more than tools. They had touched color, canvas, creation. Somewhere in this very room, proof of me waited. And when that truth rose to the surface, it would not roar with anger. It would speak with the quiet authority of justice. The art dealer arrived with the air of someone who carried authority without needing to announce it. His presence alone shifted the rhythm of the room. Conversations dimmed, movements slowed. Eyes followed him as though he were the axis on which the gallery spun. He didn't wear his power in clothes or jewelry, but in the calm weight of his gaze, the certainty that he could decide what was valuable and what was worthless with a single nod. My son moved toward him with eagerness, almost trembling beneath the surface of his polished confidence, desperate to be seen, to be validated. They shook hands firmly, and in that single exchange, my son tried to prove that he belonged in this world. I stood nearby, unnoticed, invisible in plain sight. The dealer's eyes never landed on me. They brushed past me as one might pass over a servant, someone whose presence required neither acknowledgement nor respect. He asked to see the collection in a voice that was smooth but commanding, and my son obeyed without hesitation, leading him deeper into the gallery with the pride of a man unveiling treasures he believed he owned. As they walked, I followed at a distance, each step heavy, each moment pressing against me like a reminder of where I stood in my son's world. He didn't introduce me. He didn't glance back to see if I came along. To him, I was a piece of background, a shadow that might embarrass him if given too much light. The dealer and my son moved from canvas to canvas, speaking in the language of collectors, phrases about technique, about provenance, about value, words that sounded rich but hollow, as if they stripped the paintings of their soul and turned them into currency. I watched the dealer tilt his head toward each frame, inspecting details with the cool detachment of a man who had seen too much to be impressed. My son's voice rose and fell beside him, his laughter forced, his enthusiasm sharpened to the edge of desperation. He wanted approval. He wanted to be told that his taste, his choices, his acquisitions made him a man of refinement. He wanted the dealer's recognition as proof that he had risen above the simplicity of where he came from, above me. But what he could not understand was that art does not yield to money alone. It does not bow to collectors or bend to the weight of a handshake. Art carries truth, and truth waits patiently until someone has the courage to face it. I looked at the paintings on the walls, their colors vibrating softly under the gallery lights, and I felt something stirred deep in my chest. A memory, a familiarity, a voice I had not heard in years whispering through pigments and strokes. My son believed this night was his triumph, but he had no idea that his pride rested on a foundation he had chosen to forget. The dealer's silence as he studied each piece was heavier than any compliment could have been. He carried the power to expose or to affirm, to reveal a story my son thought he had buried. I stayed in the background, my heart steady but expectant, waiting for the moment when eyes trained to see beneath the surface would find what my son had spent his life trying to ignore. And as the dealer moved closer to the next canvas, his steps measured, his gaze narrowing with focus, I felt the air shift in the room. Something was coming, something inevitable. My son, still smiling, still performing, did not yet know that the very truth he feared most was already written on the walls around him, waiting for one hand, one pair of eyes, to reveal it. My son stood in the center of the room, as though it were a stage built for him alone, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention, but not enough to break the careful elegance of the gallery. He swept his hand toward the canvases on the wall with a flourish that felt rehearsed, his tone heavy with pride. He spoke of acquisitions, of taste, of curation, words that sounded important in the mouths of men who never lifted more than a glass of wine. He spoke as though collecting art was a form of creation itself, as though choosing what to buy was the same as knowing what it cost to make it. His eyes glimmered with the thrill of belonging to a circle that, in truth, did not even see him. But in that moment, he believed he had arrived. I stood behind him, watching the canvases glow under the soft white light. At first, I tried to see them as the others did, objects of prestige, ornaments of wealth. But the longer I looked, the less distance I felt between myself and the colors that breathed quietly on those walls. The strokes were not just strokes to me. They were muscle memory. The way the brush pulled slightly thinner at the end of a curve. The way the blue was layered in two, maybe three shades to give depth that could not be captured in one. The faint tremble in a line that had not been erased but embraced. It was all achingly familiar. I had done this. I had lived this. He spoke as though these paintings belonged to him, as though he had earned the right to parade them in front of strangers. But I knew better. He did not know the nights that lived inside those frames, the hours when hands cramped with fatigue but kept moving, when the world outside was collapsing, yet a single candle burned above a canvas because creation refused to wait. He did not know how silence feels when you are alone with your work, when each color is both a confession and a salvation. He could not know, because he had never asked. I said nothing. My silence was heavier than any interruption. I let him play the role he craved, the role of the man with taste, the man with wealth, the man who believed he had transcended his beginnings. But my chest ached with the knowledge that he was building his triumph on soil he did not even recognize. The familiarity of those paintings was not coincidence. They were fragments of me, echoes of nights and days I had lived and left behind. My signature might have been small, tucked in the corner, fading with time, but it was there, my breath, my soul, my proof. And as he spoke, the dealer leaned in closer, his sharp eyes narrowing, his expression tightening with interest. He was not listening to my son's boasts anymore. He was studying. He was searching. I saw it in the tilt of his head, the stillness of his body. He had noticed something my son did not want to see, something my silence had already begun to whisper. The unveiling was not the art on the wall. It was the truth inside it. Truth that waited, patient and steady, to be recognized. My son's pride swelled as he continued, blind to the fact that each word he spoke brought him closer to the edge of exposure. He believed the light was shining on him, but I knew, with a certainty that made my heart pound, that the light was about to reveal me. And still I stayed silent, letting the ache press deeper, letting the storm gather quietly around us. because some truths are too strong to be rushed. They must arrive in their own time, when silence finally breaks, and the world can no longer pretend not to see. The dealer stopped mid-stride, his hand suspended in the air like a conductor's baton caught between movements. The conversation around him faltered, voices softening, laughter thinning, as though the entire gallery sensed a shift, but could not yet name it. He leaned in toward one canvas, not with the admiration of a casual observer, but with the precision of a man who had trained his eyes to see what others missed. His body stilled completely, his gaze narrowing, every fraction of his attention pulled into the lower corner of the painting. I saw it instantly, the change in his face. The cool detachment he had worn like armor cracked, and something alive flickered behind his eyes. Surprise, recognition, perhaps even reverence. It was not the color that caught him, not the layered strokes or the weight of light across the canvas. It was something smaller, quieter, something most people in that room would never have noticed. His eyes had found what my son had spent his whole life overlooking. My breath caught in my chest. For a moment, I feared he would say it aloud too soon, tear away the thin veil of performance before the silence had built its full weight. My son stood beside him, still smiling, still eager, unaware of the tension gathering in the air. He spoke of the artist as though he were a mystery, a genius he had discovered, weaving his own story into theirs, claiming some imagined closeness. But the dealer no longer listened. He was elsewhere, somewhere inside the detail he had uncovered, somewhere closer to me than to my son. Time slowed. I could hear the faint clink of glasses being set down, the shuffle of feet drawing nearer, the rustle of dresses and suits as people leaned forward, curious about what had caught the dealer's attention. Even those who had ignored me, who had swept past me as though I were invisible, now mirrored his pause. It was as though the entire room was being pulled by an unseen thread, tightening, converging toward the truth written in that fragile corner of paint. The ache in my chest deepened, but beneath it grew something else, something dangerous, something unstoppable. Recognition. I knew what he was looking at. I had written it with my own hand, signed it with fingers that once trembled, not from weakness, but from exhaustion and devotion. It had been years, decades even, but ink and paint have a way of outlasting silence. My son had paraded the canvas as his treasure, but the truth clung stubbornly to it, a whisper no wealth could erase. I was here. I made this. I stayed silent, gripping the storm inside me, letting the moment expand until it filled the room with anticipation. The dealer's lips parted slightly, his brow furrowing as though memory itself was clawing its way forward, demanding acknowledgement. My son shifted beside him, finally noticing the stillness, the weight of eyes gathering, the way the dealer's expression had changed. Pride wavered in his face, unease slipping in through the cracks, and then the dealer stepped closer, lowering himself until his eyes were level with the signature. His hand rose again, this time not to gesture broadly, but to point, precise, unwavering, heavy with intent. His silence spoke louder than words. He had found it. The world around us held its breath, and in that fragile pause, I knew the life my son had tried so hard to hide was about to be revealed. Not in argument, not in confrontation, but in a single undeniable truth etched into paint and time. His finger descended slowly, as if guided not by his will but by something heavier, an unseen gravity pulling him toward the truth. He touched the lower right corner of the canvas, the place most people's eyes would never travel, the place where names hide quietly, trusting that one day someone might care enough to notice. The light caught the faded strokes of ink, worn by time, softened by years of neglect, but it was still there. My name, my handwriting, my mark. For a heartbeat I could not breathe. It was as though the years folded into that single instant, years when I had worked in silence, creating not for applause but for survival, for expression, for the raw need to leave something behind when everything else could be taken. I remembered the night I signed that canvas. My hand had trembled, not from uncertainty, but from exhaustion. The lamp had flickered weakly, the world outside asleep, while I pressed my name into the corner as though pressing my soul into permanence. I never imagined it would one day hang here, in a room that reeked of wealth and pride. Yet there it was, proof that my life had not passed unnoticed, even if my son wished it so. The dealer's face shifted from neutrality into something reverent, almost cautious, as though he realized he was standing on the edge of discovery. His finger did not move away. It lingered on the corner, holding the moment still, commanding silence without a word. Every eye in the gallery followed his gesture, first to the signature, then, slowly, to me. A murmur spread through the crowd, thin and uncertain, like the first crack of thunder before the storm. And there stood my son, frozen beside him, his pride collapsing in his eyes, his smile faltering. He had built his entire evening, his entire sense of importance, on the illusion that these works belonged solely to him, his collection, his taste, his triumph. But in that instant the foundation gave way. The truth shone through, brighter than all the golden frames. He had been boasting about what was never his, what he had dismissed as relics, what he had tried to bury beneath polish and wealth, bore my name. I stayed still, my silence heavier than speech. To announce myself would have been easy, but unnecessary. The dealer's finger, my signature, the stunned faces around us, they had spoken for me. My son could no longer erase me, could no longer push me into the corner, as if I had never existed. My presence was written into the canvas itself, undeniable, eternal. The ache in my chest shifted into something different now, not pride, not triumph, but a deep, quiet justice. This was not revenge, though part of me longed to watch his arrogance collapse completely. It was balance, a reminder that truth, however deeply buried, will find its way to the surface. And tonight, it had chosen to rise through ink and memory. My son looked at me then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. His eyes were not the eyes of a man in control, but of a child caught in the act of hiding something precious, only to discover it was never his to hide. In that gaze I saw fear, shame, and something else he would never admit aloud, dependence. For all his efforts to erase me, he now stood exposed by me. The gallery did not applaud. It did not erupt. Instead, it fell into the kind of silence that feels like judgment, heavy and suffocating. And in that silence, my name glowed brighter than any spotlight, etched into the canvas, etched into time. My son had wanted me to stay in the corner, invisible. But the truth had placed me in the center of the room where no one could look away. The room grew still in a way that was almost unnatural, as though even the air itself refused to move. The clinking of glasses stopped, conversations froze mid-sentence, and the polite murmur of laughter died in people's throats. All that remained was the dealer's finger, resting like a verdict on the corner of the canvas, and the faint tremor in my son's voice as his practiced speech unraveled. He had been talking with such certainty just moments ago, each word polished, each phrase rehearsed for effect, but now his tongue caught on silence. His confidence collapsed, leaving only fragments, half-formed words that could not shield him from what everyone saw. Slowly his head turned toward me, not with the pride of a son who introduces his father, but with the dread of someone who knows a truth has escaped his grasp. His eyes locked onto mine, wide, unsettled, almost pleading, but beneath the surface fear lived there. The kind of fear that comes when the mask slips and there is nothing left to hide behind. He had wanted me to stay invisible, hidden in the corner like an unwanted relic, and now, against his will, the room itself had dragged me into the light. The friends who had brushed past me earlier, nodding with shallow politeness before turning their backs, now stared with new eyes. Their expressions shifted, unsure, wavering between shock and a kind of reluctant respect. It was as though I had stepped out of the very painting, as though the man they had dismissed as the old one he brought along had suddenly grown larger than the frames around us. In their silence, I felt something I had not felt in years, not approval, not admiration, but acknowledgement, the weight of being seen, the weight. My son's lips parted, as though he wanted to say something, to explain, to bend the truth in his favor, but words failed him. What could he possibly say? The signature was there. My name lived in the corner of that canvas, unmovable, undeniable. No speech could erase it, no wealth could replace it, no dismissal could silence it. It was proof, carved into paint and time, that I had existed not just as a father, not just as a man of labor, but as a creator. And now the whole room knew. I did not move. I did not step forward, did not claim the stage, did not raise my voice. I only stood where I was, letting the silence spread around me like a tide. Sometimes silence is louder than rage, sharper than accusation. It forces people to see what they tried to ignore. And in that gallery, silence became a mirror, reflecting my son's arrogance back at him, stripping it bare in front of the very people he had tried so hard to impress. Inside me, the ache deepened, but it was no longer only pain. It was release. Years of invisibility, years of being dismissed, years of being told without words that I did not belong. Suddenly, all of it found balance. I did not need applause. I did not need recognition. All I needed was this moment, when the truth stood taller than his pride and my silence spoke louder than his voice. The dealer finally turned his gaze from the canvas to me. His eyes lingered, steady, measuring, but not with condescension. There was a kind of respect there, unspoken but clear. The respect of one who knows what it means to create, who can recognize the hand behind the work even when time has tried to erase it. He said nothing, but in that silence I understood. The truth had been seen, and that was enough. My son's friends looked back at him, waiting for him to recover, to spin the moment, to reclaim control. But there was nothing left for him to grasp. The silence had stripped him of every borrowed word, and for the first time in years, I did not feel small. I did not feel hidden. I felt present, and in that stillness, I knew the night no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the truth, and the truth had finally chosen to stand where no one could look away. In that moment, as the gallery stood frozen and the dealer's finger lingered on my name, memory swept over me with such force it nearly pulled me under. I was no longer in that polished hall of gold frames and polished marble floors. I was back in a cramped room, its walls thin enough to let the winter winds seep through, its light sustained by a single flickering lamp. The air smelled of turpentine and damp wood. The table was cluttered with brushes worn to their last bristles, rags stiff with dried paint, scraps of canvas too precious to throw away. And there I was, sitting in silence, hunched forward, painting as though the act itself was breath. Back then, art was not luxury. It was not prestige or status. It was survival. It was the only way to put meaning into days that felt empty and nights that pressed too heavily on the chest. I painted not because I believed someone would one day hang my work under perfect lights, but because I had to. Because if I didn't take the pain, the exhaustion, the loneliness and press it into color, I would collapse beneath the weight of it. Each brushstroke was a heartbeat. Each shade of paint was a memory I could not put into words. And when I signed my name in the corner of each canvas, it was not to claim ownership. It was to remind myself I was still here, still alive, still capable of creating something the world could not take away. Those nights had been long. Some ended with my hands shaking too hard to hold the brush steady. Others ended with tears I wiped on the same rag that cleaned the paint. There were times I doubted if it mattered at all, if any of it would survive. The world around me had little use for a man with dreams that couldn't be weighed or sold, and so I kept it quiet. I stacked the paintings against the wall, one after the other, like hidden chapters of a story no one cared to read. I never spoke of them to my son. To him, I was the man who fixed what was broken, who brought food home, who worked with tools and sweat. He never knew about the nights when, long after he had fallen asleep, I would sit alone and pour myself into colors. And now those forgotten fragments of me stood here, in this hall where collectors measured worth by price tags and whispered prestige. My work, born of hunger and silence, hung proudly in gilded frames while strangers in polished shoes studied it with reverence. I had never dreamed of this, not because I couldn't imagine it, but because I never needed it. I didn't paint for them. I didn't paint for this. And yet here it was, proof that even what is born in silence has a way of speaking when the time is right. The ache in my chest deepened, but it was not the ache of sorrow. It was something harder to define, something that sat between grief and vindication. To see my life's quiet labor paraded as my son's possession was bitter, but to see it recognized at all was undeniable. For years I had lived with the fear that my work would vanish with me, unseen, unvalued, forgotten. But tonight, against every expectation, it breathed in the open, seen by eyes trained to notice, seen by people who could no longer look away. I glanced at my son, standing rigid beside the dealer, sweat gathering at his temples, though the room was cool. He had wanted the recognition for himself, but recognition has its own sense of justice. It does not cling to the hand that craves it. It finds the hand that earned it. And in that instant I realized something he had yet to learn. The world might forget a name, but a true mark, once made, cannot be erased. And so I stood in the silence, my memories alive in every brushstroke around me, my past resurrected not by speeches or boasts, but by the quiet power of paint, of color, of truth that had waited patiently for its unveiling. The betrayal was not just in the words he had spoken to me before we entered the gallery, not just in his sharp command to stay in the corner and keep my hands away from the world he thought he had built. The betrayal was far deeper, more deliberate. It was that he wanted to bury the very roots of the pride he now paraded so loudly. His entire performance tonight, his polished voice, his borrowed confidence, all of it stood on something he could not bring himself to admit. Me, my hands, my name, my work. To be hidden by strangers is one thing. It wounds, but it does not destroy. But to be hidden by your own blood, by the child who once held your hand, who once looked at you as the axis of his small and fragile world, that is a wound no one prepares you for. He wanted me there only as proof of existence, but not proof of worth. He wanted me quiet, unseen, so that his friends and the dealer would never suspect that behind his collection, behind his pride, behind the art he flaunted so confidently, stood a father he had dismissed as nothing more than old and irrelevant. I thought of all the nights I had gone without rest so he could sleep peacefully. The winters when I patched the roof so the snow wouldn't seep in. The endless hours of labor when my body broke but my will refused to. I had never once asked him to notice. I never demanded gratitude. But now I saw that he had not simply forgotten. He had chosen to erase me. It was not ignorance. It was shame. He did not want these people to know his roots, because he thought my calluses would stain his polished image. He thought my name would diminish his own. That was the knife that cut deepest. Not that he overlooked me in the introductions, not that he refused to acknowledge me in the circle of his so-called friends, but that he looked at me and decided I was unworthy of being tied to his success. He wanted the fruit without the soil, the light without the shadow, the crown without the labor. And yet in doing so, he severed the very lifeline that gave his pride meaning. For what is a collection worth if the one who built it is cast aside as nothing? The canvas spoke louder than him. That small signature, that quiet corner, revealed what he had worked so hard to conceal. And when the dealer touched it, when the silence of the gallery turned all eyes toward me, I felt not triumph, but a terrible grief. Because the truth was not just that my work had endured, it was that my own son had tried to erase me from it. Betrayal is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, dressed in indifference, polished with polite words. Sometimes it looks like a son straightening his suit while his father is told to stay silent. And yet the sting is sharper than open hatred, because betrayal comes from a place where trust once lived. And trust, when it is broken, never breaks clean. It splinters into 1,000 sharp pieces that cut again and again when memory drifts too close. I stood there, my chest heavy, the weight of years pressing down on me, and I realized his betrayal had already happened long before this night. Tonight only revealed it. Tonight the mask slipped. Tonight everyone saw. And perhaps that was justice, though it did not feel like victory. It felt like standing in the wreckage of something that was supposed to endure forever, the bond between a father and a son. And yet, as the silence deepened, and the dealer's finger still rested on my name, I knew that no amount of shame, no act of erasure, could undo what had been created. He could try to bury me, but the truth had already risen. My son's pride, his so-called triumph, stood on foundations he had never built, and now the whole room knew it. The dealer turned slowly, and in the stillness of the gallery his movement felt monumental, as if the very air shifted around him. He was a man accustomed to controlling rooms with silence, and now that silence pressed down on every soul present. His eyes lingered on the canvas one last time before lifting, his gaze cutting across the crowd with the weight of judgment. And then his voice came, low, deliberate, carrying a gravity that needed no flourish. This signature, it belongs to the artist. The words rolled out like a verdict, like the striking of a gavel, undeniable and final. He did not turn to my son, who had been eagerly waiting for affirmation, clinging to the hope of being praised as a discerning collector. No. The dealer's eyes bypassed him completely, as if he were no longer even part of the conversation. Instead, he looked directly at me. His stare was unwavering, sharp, yet respectful, as though he were measuring not just a man, but the life inside him. And in that instant, something shifted in the room. For the first time that evening, the weight of every gaze landed on me. Those who had walked past me with shallow smiles, those who had dismissed me as nothing more than an aging father clinging to relevance, those who had treated me as invisible, they all turned now, their eyes widening as if they were seeing me for the very first time. The murmur of the crowd rose like a tide, then fell again into stunned quiet. I stood there, motionless, yet I felt taller than I had in years. My son's face betrayed him. The carefully arranged pride collapsed into a hollow mask, his mouth slightly open, his eyes darting between me and the dealer, searching desperately for a way out of the truth. But there was no way out. The spotlight he had worked so hard to place upon himself had swung uninvited to me. He could not stop it. He could not contain it. The truth was too strong, too permanent, written not in memory or rumor, but in ink on canvas, in a signature that carried my blood and my breath. I had not spoken a word, yet everything I had buried in silence spoke for me now. The years of labor, the nights by lamplight, the quiet ache of creating without recognition, they all rose up, embodied in that single moment. And as the dealer's words settled into the air, I realized something deeper. Justice does not always come as applause or as revenge. Sometimes it comes in the quiet acknowledgement of truth, spoken aloud in a place where lies cannot survive. I felt the ache in my chest loosen, just slightly. Not because the betrayal was healed, it never would be, but because the silence had been broken in my favor. My son could no longer deny where part of his pride came from. He could no longer bury the soil from which his tree had grown, and whether he admitted it or not, the world around us had witnessed it. The dealer's eyes softened just a little as he kept them fixed on me. It was not pity. It was recognition, the kind only one who understood creation could give. He gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, but in that nod there was respect. Respect not for the man my son pretended to be, but for the man I had always been, even in silence. And as the room continued to stare, waiting for me to respond, I remained still, because I did not need to raise my voice. My name had already spoken louder than I ever could. My son's authority evaporated in a single breath, as though the air itself had turned against him. All the polish he had worn so carefully, his smooth gestures, his crafted smile, the way he wielded his voice like a tool, shattered under the weight of a truth he could not silence. Every introduction he had delivered with pride, every boast he had scattered through the room like glitter, now lay in ruins at his feet. The room no longer belonged to him. Its gravity had shifted, tilting, bending toward the truth, toward the corner of the canvas where my name lived, faint but undeniable. The faces of his friends told the story more cruelly than any words could. These were the men and women who had nodded along to his boasts, who had treated him as though he were the gatekeeper of culture, the man of taste among them. Now they looked at him with eyes that asked silent questions he could not answer. Their glances slid away from him quickly, turning toward me, as if to anchor themselves in something steadier, something more real. My son, once the center of their attention, became peripheral, still standing there but no longer commanding the room. The dealer's declaration had carried more weight than an entire speech, more finality than 1,000 arguments. His words had cut through the performance and left only fact, and fact, once revealed, cannot be undone. The authority my son had borrowed collapsed because borrowed authority is brittle. It crumbles at the first touch of truth. I did not move. I did not claim his place. I remained where I had been all evening, still and silent. Yet I felt the current of the room flowing toward me. It was not triumph I felt, not pride, not victory, but a strange, heavy justice. The balance had shifted, not because I fought for it, but because the truth demanded it. My son had built his image on the illusion of ownership, of refinement, of superiority. But illusions cannot withstand the weight of what is real, and reality stood on the wall, signed in my hand. I watched him shift his weight, his confidence draining with each second of silence. He tried to smile again, but the smile was brittle, unconvincing. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught like dry leaves, lifeless, unable to take flight. For the first time that night he looked small, not because I had diminished him, but because his pride had no foundation to stand upon. His arrogance had hollowed him out, and now the hollowness showed. The room itself seemed to lean toward me, not with applause, not with celebration, but with recognition. Recognition is quieter, steadier. It does not need noise to be real. And as I felt their eyes on me, I understood that I did not need their approval to know my worth. But still, the shift mattered, because it was not about me being elevated. It was about him no longer being able to bury me beneath his shadow. Every lie he had built crumbled in that silence. Every effort to erase me collapsed in the glow of that fragile signature. He had wanted to control the story, to stand as the master of the room, but now the story spoke for itself, and it spoke against him. The weight of the night pressed differently now. No longer pressing me into invisibility, it pressed him into exposure. And in that shift I felt something I had not felt in years, the quiet return of dignity, not given by him, not borrowed from them, but rising from the truth that had always been mine. I did not need to shout. I did not need to remind him of who I was, or list the years I had given, or speak of the nights when silence was my only witness. The truth had already risen, stronger than any voice, etched in ink and paint long before this night. My son's performance had relied on noise, on boasting, on introductions, on borrowed authority, but the canvas carried a language older, heavier, undeniable. A signature needs no defense. It does not beg to be seen. It waits patient until the world finally opens its eyes. And so I stood there in the hush that followed, feeling the strange weight of justice settle into my chest. It was not loud, not explosive, not dramatic like the stories people imagine when they think of vindication. It was quieter, deeper. It moved like water seeping into dry earth, filling the cracks that had long been left empty. My dignity did not arrive with applause or recognition from strangers. It had been here all along, waiting for me to remember it. Tonight, the world simply caught up to what had always been true. I looked at my son and saw the shape of his silence. He did not dare speak, because he knew that whatever he said would sound like a child's protest against an undeniable truth. He had wanted to place me in the shadows, but now he stood in them himself. And I, without moving, without raising my hand or my voice, was seen clearly. That was justice, not revenge, not humiliation, but balance restored. What he never understood is that true authority never announces itself. It does not shout to be noticed. It does not scramble to hold the spotlight. It simply exists, and when the time is right, it is undeniable. My life had not been built on grand speeches or titles. It had been built in the quiet rhythm of labor, in sacrifices that left no audience applauding. And perhaps that is why tonight felt so sharp, because the truth that had been invisible for so long now stood in full view, needing no decoration, no defense. The gallery itself seemed to bow to the silence. The dealer had spoken, the crowd had shifted, but now no one moved, no one dared disturb what had been revealed. Their eyes on me were not filled with pity or even admiration. They were filled with acknowledgement, and acknowledgement is more powerful than praise. Praise can be given and taken away. Acknowledgement cannot be erased. Once they had seen me, they could never again pretend I was not there. I thought of the countless times I had swallowed words, choosing silence because I knew they would fall on deaf ears. I thought of how many times I had allowed myself to be diminished, believing that keeping peace mattered more than defending dignity. But tonight, I understood something different. Silence is not always defeat. Sometimes silence is a weapon, sharper than accusation, more enduring than anger. Tonight my silence had spoken, not in weakness, but in strength. My son lowered his eyes at last, the collapse complete. He could no longer hold himself upright under the weight of what had been revealed, and I, standing quietly with the storm settled inside me, felt no need to gloat, no need to wound him further. Because justice, when it is real, does not demand revenge. It demands nothing. It simply is. And so I breathed deeply, letting the air of the gallery fill my lungs, and for the first time that evening, I felt lighter. The fight I had never spoken had already been won, not through power, not through argument, but through the quiet endurance of truth. When I left the gallery, I walked taller than when I had entered. The polished floor beneath my feet no longer echoed with the sound of hesitation, no longer carried the weight of invisibility. Each step was steady, deliberate, as though the building itself acknowledged me now. Behind me I could hear my son's footsteps, softer, slower, burdened by the weight of something he had never expected to carry, shame. He had walked into that room believing he owned it, believing his voice and his image were enough to command respect. But he left behind me now, his shadow longer, his pride crumbling into silence. The dealer's words still rang in the air, not just in my ears, but in the memory of every person who had stood in that gallery, the artist. 2 simple words, but they carried the force of judgment, of revelation, of truth set free. They did not belong to my son, and they never would. They belonged to me. Not because I asked for them, not because I fought for them, but because they were mine from the beginning. All along, my name had been there, written into the corner of the canvas like a quiet heartbeat. And though time had tried to fade it, though silence had tried to bury it, though even my own blood had tried to erase it, justice had revealed it. Outside, the night air felt different, cleaner, as though I had been holding my breath for years and finally exhaled. The city lights shimmered against the dark, but I did not need their glow. I carried my own light now, a light that no humiliation could extinguish. I was not leaving as the old man in the corner. I was not leaving as a guest in my son's borrowed world. I was leaving as what I had always been, the creator, the maker, the man whose name outlasted silence. My son trailed behind, his eyes lowered, his shoulders no longer squared with pride. He did not speak, for there was nothing left to say. Shame is a heavy language, one that does not form words easily, and perhaps it was better this way. For years I had given him words, advice, guidance, stories. Tonight it was my silence that spoke, and he had heard it, whether he wanted to or not. As we reached the street, I turned my face toward the night sky and let the cool air wash over me. A strange peace settled in my chest. Not joy, not triumph. Something quieter, something steadier, dignity. It had not been given to me by that dealer, or the crowd, or even my son. It had been mine all along, carved in labor, written in paint, sealed in silence until the world finally recognized it. They had tried to make me invisible. They had tried to corner me, to reduce me, to erase me. But you cannot erase what is already etched into truth. You cannot silence what has already been spoken through creation. I was not a guest. I was not an intruder. I was not a shadow. I was the name written where no one could erase it. And as I walked away from the gallery, I knew that name would remain, long after the lights dimmed, long after the voices faded. The canvases would endure. The truth would endure. And so would I.